do. Shalom. Hi, Rav. I'm wondering,
Shalom.
Motzei Shabbat, how am I to
Mhm.
interact with by calling or messaging non-Jewish people or calling them at their place of business if they're open for their services? Is there any difference? Or like, do I
In
do
the
I
same time zone or different time zones?
in let's say I'm in Israel and they're in North America, it's still Shabbat in North America. For non-Jewish people who are in Shabbat.
Yeah. Well, Shvitat Kelim is a machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. According to Beis Shammai, not only must you rest on Shabbos, meaning uh, desist from any malacha, from any of the 39 categories of malacha, but your kelim, your possessions must also rest. According to Beis Shammai, therefore, you cannot cause utensils to violate Shabbos in a different time zone. According to Beis Shammai, therefore, you cannot do that. According to Beis Shammai, you cannot use a timer, a Shabbos timer, because not only must you rest, but your utensils must also rest on Shabbos. That's Beis Shammai. We, not surprisingly, do not paskin like Beis Shammai. We paskin like Beis Hillel. Ein shvitat kelim. According to Beis Shammai, you must rest, but not necessarily your kelim, your utensils don't have to rest. Therefore, it's permissible to use a Shabbos timer to set it in motion before Shabbos, and then your timer works on Shabbos, and therefore it's okay is if you do not have Shabbos because you're in a time zone where it's not Shabbos, you can telephone into a time zone where it is Shabbos. If a non-Jew is answering the phone, so there's no one in this story who's violating Shabbos, and all is well, and therefore no objection at all to doing that. Now I know that many frum companies, if you're really frum, then you close down your internet site where you market your products when it's Shabbos in your time zone. I don't know exactly how this helps you because as soon as you open up your internet site for marketing your product, it's going to be Shabbos in a different time zone. But that's what the really from people do. But if you are in a time zone where it's not Shabbos and you want to order, buy something from Amazon, and they're in a time zone where it's not Shabbos, no objection, no objection at all to doing that. Go for it. As far as dealing with Jews in Chutz La'aretz, of course, you don't want to be machshil the Jew in Chutz La'aretz. You don't want to cause the Jew in Chutz La'aretz to violate Shabbos, and therefore, if it's Shabbos in the time zone of the person you are calling up, and the person you are calling up is Jewish, then making their phone ring is inviting them to violate Shabbos by answering the phone, and this you do not want to do. Uh, remember in my grandparents' generation, they used to have you know what fax machines are? Facsimile. I don't know if they still exist or not. They still exist? Okay.
They even
Yeah.
have digitized ones like voice over IP. They have fax over IP.
Oh, fantastic. Well, if you want to send a fax to a time zone where it is still Shabbos, of course, if you're sending it to non-Jews, no problem at all. But if you want to send a fax, for example, to family members, you want to send a fax to Jews where it is a Shabbos in their time zone, you should give some thought to upside down, the right side up and upside down. You should put the fax into the machine, or if it's digitalized, you should orient it up and down so that it will come out of their machine right side up so that they can read it without handling it. It's muktzah, but if it comes out of their machine and they can just read it easily, there's no objection to putting eyes on it and reading it. So if you have some good news that you want to share with family members in Chutz La'aretz, and it's a Shabbos there, send them a fax, but give some thought to whether it should be oriented this way or that way to make it easier for them to read right side up. Oh, the baby moved into a different frame. Didn't, oh no, oh, we have two babies. Oh, oh, okay, how sweet, how sweet. Okay, any other questions of a halachic nature that we can talk about before coming to eating on
Yes,
Hanukkah?
I have a
Yeah.
quick one. If you have some product which is a hechsher that you don't use, can you give it to another from Jew?
Ay, ay,
Can you
ay,
give?
ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. The rule is as follows. Lifnei iver lo teitan michshol. You're not allowed to put a stumbling block before the blind. That means you're not allowed to help. You're not allowed to enable another Jew to violate the Torah. And therefore, you cannot give or even sell a non-kosher product to Jews. Um, uh, this creates a little bit of a problem if you're operating a Jewish grocery store or a supermarket in Chutz La'aretz. If you're selling non-kosher products to a non-Jewish clientele in Chutz La'aretz, that's fine. But if some Jews might come into your shop, that's problematic. Here, the majority of posts, not all, but a large majority of posts can hold it's okay because you're not actually doing anything to invite Jewish customers to buy non-kosher products in your store. Um, you're hoping that they're going to select only the kosher products, and that's their choice. You're not machshil them. You're not causing them to sin. They're doing it with their eyes open. It's their own decision. Um, now, let's consider an extreme case of the situation you describe. By looking at an extreme case, we can clarify the underlying concepts. Imagine for a moment that I have a neighbor who had an accident, and my neighbor, he or she, has both arms in plaster casts. It happens. You have an accident sometimes and break bones in both arms. It can happen, and that person, of course, needs someone to feed him or her. Someone has to put the food in the person's mouth. The person cannot feed himself, cannot feed herself. So you're visiting Bikur Cholim, you're visiting the sick person, and you say, "Oh, while you're here, can you feed me lunch? I need someone to stick the food in my mouth." Well, if it's a Jewish person you're visiting and the food is not kosher, you cannot do that. Um, uh, uh, but here's the rule: if if the Jewish person is capable of doing it himself, if the Jewish person is capable of doing it herself and uh, knows, in some sense, has an awareness, some awareness that it's wrong, then you are not causing that person to sin. That person has chosen to sin by himself or by herself. In the same example I just gave, let's extend the example a little bit. You're visiting by a sick friend, Jewish neighbor, Jewish friend who is sick. And while you're visiting, the Jewish sick person says, "Oh, can you do me a favor? I'm stuck here at home. I'm sick. Can you go to the grocery store? Can you go to the supermarket and pick up such and such for me?" And it's not kosher. Well, in a situation where the Jewish person is unable to do it himself or herself, you're not allowed to supply that. In a situation where the sick person is capable of going to the store himself or herself, and just you're going to make it a favor for them. If they could do it, then you are allowed to buy that product and bring it to them. Up until this point, I've spoken only about things which are truly prohibited. Now, to focus on your specific question, what if it's just the other hechsher, the one we don't rely upon? Um, well, the rule is as follows. The isur, the prohibition is lifnei iver lo titen michshol. Do not put a stumbling block before the blind. Do not help. Do not enable another Jewish person to sin? Well, if there's a machlokas poskim, if the rabbis legitimately disagree about what's permitted and what's prohibited, which happens all the time, every Jew has the right, every Jew has the privilege to follow whichever rabbis they want. And therefore, if the person you're dealing with has chosen to follow the rabbis who say such and such a product is kosher, assuming the rabbis are serious and not assuming that we're talking about Torah, real rabbanim, not reform rabbis or something like this, then of course the other Jew is allowed to rely upon that lenient opinion, and therefore when that person is relying upon the lenient opinion, he or she is not sinning at all. Kol hanoheg al pi hora'at chacham. Anyone who does whatever he or she does according to the instructions of a rabbi is not sinning. Even though other rabbis disagree, but you're allowed to follow the opinion of the rabbi who told you that it's mutter. And if there's no sin in the other Jew relying upon that hechsher, then there's no lifnei eva lo ten mikshel. You're not enabling the person to sin if he or she is not sinning, and therefore, of course, the one with both arms in plaster casts wants to be fed, spoon-fed food with a hechsher that I do not rely upon at all, but other rabbis say it's kosher. I can spoon it into that person's mouth, all the more so if that person says, save me the trouble of going to the supermarket. I'm feeling very weak. I haven't recovered yet. Buy such and such a product with such and such a hechsher. Well, if it's a legitimate hechsher, but I reject it, that person is entitled to rely upon it. No sin, no foul, and therefore no prohibition of putting a stumbling block before the blind. All is well. Okay.
Thank you.
Let me add one more comment. Maaseh shehaya kach haya. The following is a story which is told by Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was, among other things, Rosh Yeshiva of Kol Torah in the Bayit V'Gan neighborhood here in Yerushalayim. Back in the good old days, when they were setting the foundation stone, setting the first stone in the construction of the new Beis HaMidrash, there was a big celebration. A lot of people were invited, and of course, all the big donors were invited. It was a hot day in the summer in Yerushalayim. Well, every day is a hot day in the summer in Yerushalayim. The sun was shining brightly. Well, the sun always shines brightly in the summer in Yerushalayim. And the people were gathered around in this hot, sunny day for the celebration of setting the cornerstone for the new construction of the Beis HaMidrash of Yeshivat Kol Torah. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, one of the Rosh Yeshiva, he was one of the Rosh Yeshiva, noticed that one of the big donors was standing there sweating profusely. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach takes a glass of water and offers it to the donor. That's nice, isn't it? Well, afterwards, the Talmidim who had observed this ganged up on Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and said, what was the heter for doing that? That donor is not Torah observant. He drank the water without reciting a bracha. You enabled him, you helped him to sin. You enabled him, you helped him to drink the water in a prohibited way without reciting the bracha. Why did you do that? Well, since the Talmidim ganged up on him on this issue, he decided to publish a tshuva on the matter. That's how I know the whole story. And in the tshuva, he explains that when dealing with others in problematic situations, halachically problematic situations, you have to consider not the specific event at hand, rather you have to consider the universal impact which your behavior will have on that person. At the moment, we know that this non-Torah observant donor to Yeshivat Kol Torah is someone who is sympathetic, someone who likes Torah, someone who is willing to support Torah, someone who is willing to support Torah Judaism. Well, that's pretty good. If I would refuse to offer him a glass of water, I'd run the risk of alienating him from Torah Judaism. He might no longer like Torah observant Jews, and viewing the person I'm dealing with globally, not just in terms of this one thing. Of course, it's beneficial, spiritually beneficial for this person to retain, to maintain his positive relationship with Torah Judaism, rather than ruin that and force him into an adverse relationship with Torah Judaism. That's why I gave him the water. Okay, is that enough about this this issue? Yeah, any other issues we should address? Okay. Now let me get the stuff on eating. I just have to click share and then find where it is. Click share. Well, where is it? Here.
Just want to
Click.
confirm. I
Yes.
don't have to think twice when interacting with non-Jewish people while it's their Shabbat and I'm not in Shabbat. I don't have to think twice about messaging.
Correct. No problem at all.
Okay. I don't know where I got the idea, but okay. Thank you.
No problem at all. I'll give you a typical example. You have a relative who may or may not have just given birth in a hospital in Chutz La'aretz. It's not Shabbos here. It is Shabbos there. Well, and you would want to know whether your relative has given birth and whether all is well with baby and mother. What you can do, since it's in Chutz La'aretz, you can call up the hospital and speak with a non-Jewish nurse in the maternity division of the hospital and have a conversation with a non-Jewish nurse and ask, has given birth, and if so, how are mother and baby doing? Now, the rule, there's another rule which is very important, the rule of holchim ahar harov. How do you know whether you're speaking to a Jewish person or a non-Jewish person in Chutz La'aretz? Well, sometimes you know because you know the person. But if you're just calling up the hospital and speaking to a nurse in the maternity division, how are you supposed to know whether or not this nurse is Jewish or not? If you're speaking to a Jewish nurse, you don't want to do that when the nurse has Shabbos. The non-Jewish nurse, no objection at all. The rule is holchim ahar harov. If we're talking about a place in Chutz La'aretz, which more or less everywhere, I suppose, where the majority population is not Jewish, well, if the majority population is not Jewish, then any individual should be presumed to be non-Jewish until you have evidence to the contrary. And the other way around, if you're in Chutz La'aretz, when it is not Shabbos in Chutz La'aretz, but it is Shabbos in Eretz Yisrael, where the majority population is Jewish, the presumption is the opposite, that any nurse or anyone you speak to in the hospital is presumed to be Jewish until you have evidence to the contrary. Okay, ready for eating? Here goes. I originally we're going to begin with Resisei Laila. I'd originally put this text at the very end of my source sheet. Because it's not so halachic, it's more Hasidic. Reb Tzadok HaKohen was the greatest, or surely one of the greatest, of the Hasidic thinkers in the 19th century. A vast impact on subsequent Hasidic thinkers. There's surely no other individual in the 19th century who had more of an impact on Hasidic thought. He also happened to be a Talmud Chacham, a formidable Talmud Chacham. His tshuvot, his halachic writings are also formidable. In any event, the sefer we're quoting from Rusisei Laila is a sefer of Hasidut. Let's see what he says. B'Hatimat Talmud, when the Gemara was finally sealed, when the editing of the Gemara was completed and the work was published, we're talking about the 6th century, when Ravina and Ravashi completed the compilation of all the oral traditions, organized and structured into the different tractates. When that was finished in the generation of Ravina and Ravashi, Az Nishlam Kol HaTorah Shebal Peh. That was the end of the evolution. That was the end of the development. That was the end of the ongoing process of developing Torah Shebal Peh. Torah Shebal Peh, of course, began at Ma'amad Har Sinai, and it was an evolving, developing process, which ended around the 6th century when Ravina and Ravashi completed the publication, completed the editing of the Gemara. Just like the Torah Shebichtav, the Chumash, was finalized at Ma'amad Har Sinai, and that's it. Once it was published at Ma'amad Har Sinai, that's the text. Text stands forever. Similarly, Torah Shebal Peh Achar Chatimat Talmud. Similarly, Torah Shebal Peh, the evolution, the development ended with the close of the Gemara. Kalul Bo Kol Torah Shebal Peh. The totality of Torah Shebal Peh is in the works of Chazal. It doesn't mean only the Gemara, it means also the Mishnah and also the Midrash, but the works of Chazal came to an end in that period. All the chidushim, generation after generation, since the end of the Gemara, Rabbanim, Talmidei Chachamim have been mechadesh, innovating new ideas every generation. Hakol masha hotziu bepilpulam hachmatam betocha Talmud. All the chidushim of all the poskim through all the generations are simply derivatives of what they understood in Chazal. Hakol ramuzbo, all of it is included in the Gemara, and what subsequent generations call chidushim are really ideas which are embedded in the Gemara. It just took Talmud Chacham to draw out the ideas and make them explicit. You're wondering what all this has to do with eating on Hanukkah. We're going to get to it. Al Kain Az Huta Ktiva Shel Torah Shebal Peh. That's why it was permitted to write down Torah Shebal Peh. The Gemara says in Gittin, the Gemara says in Tamura, the Gemara says, Dvarim Shebal Peh I Atar Rashai Lechotvan. Anything in the Torah Shebal Peh is prohibited to write down, and through the generations, up until the close of the Gemara, the Torah Shebal Peh was not written down. Generation after generation memorized the whole thing until the final editing of the Gemara, and then it was written down, pen on parchment. But the writing of Torah Shebal Peh didn't occur until this time. Demashma bekam duchte az hitchilu lichtov gamkein ki az nigmar galut koma shleima de Torah. The Torah was the revelation, the knowledge of Torah Shebal Peh was growing, was evolving, was developing through the generations until the close of the Talmudic period. Then they were not permitted to write anything down. But now that we have the full, at the close of the Gemara in the 6th century, now that we have the full substance, the full body of Torah Sheba'al Peh, now it's okay to write it down. Well, Mamela, it follows, Me'az v'hala, since the end of the Talmudic period, Gam Kedushas Yimei Chanukah, Shu He'arat HaTorah Sheba'al Peh, Chanukah, which comes historically after the close of the Gemara, Chanukah is Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's not actually in the Torah. It's the Rabbanan, but it must derive, Purim and Chanukah must derive all of their spiritual energy from Torah Sheba'al Peh. Al Kain, Hitchilu Dorot Achronim Lenhog Simcha Gufanit U'Seudot Gam Kain. That's why we have Simcha, in a Ruchani sense, and that's why we have Seudot, festive meals for a physical benefit on these rabbinic holidays, Purim and Chanukah, to celebrate spiritually and physically that we now have the total corpus of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Af al pi she'enan nevi'im, b'nei nevi'im, and the B'nei Yisrael nowadays might not be nevi'im, but we are descendants of nevi'im. Kvar higia ha'ara liot murgeshet b'foal b'guf gam kein acha shu malbush klei kibul la'or shel Torah. The Jewish mind, the Jewish brain is a kli kibul, is a utensil which can hold the enlightenment of Torah. The light of Torah shines supernally, and the Jewish soul, the Jewish mind can absorb and hold that light. And that's why the poskim tell us that on Hanukkah one should eat milchik food. Why do the poskim tell us? I'm all going to see the words of the poskim. I'm just starting with the Chassidus. Why do the poskim tell us that we should eat milchik food on Hanukkah? Dugmat minhag ma'achlei chalav b'Shvuos. It's like eating milchik food on Shavuos. B'Kabbalat Torah, and Shavuos was the time when Torah shebichtav was received by the Jewish people at Ma'amad Har Sinai. The Chumash was given, just like milk, just like the baby nurses. I think it's the mother who nurses, not the baby, right? Just like the mother nurses the baby from her breast with milk, that was why they ate milchik food at Ma'amad Har Sinai. It was like they received the spiritual nourishment min hashamayim. Ikar Kabbalat Torah, Hakir Modein Torah Yitbarach, and the whole idea of acknowledging, the whole idea of internalizing, the whole idea of realizing that we have now received the Torah, that we have Torah. Well, that's an acknowledgement that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us the Torah. Mimenu yonek hakol. Everything has yonika, everything derives from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. All of Torah derives from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, just like the baby receives its sustenance from its mother. That's why they ate milk in Shavuos at Ma'amad Har Sinai. Al derech zeh, in this way, the Chanukah, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, Chanukah, and Purim as well, but we're not talking about Purim today, but Chanukah is the holiday of Torah Sheba'al Peh. It comes after the period of Torah Shebichtav. Ha'ikar hu hakaras hayanika me'em ubanim. We have to acknowledge, we have to realize, we have to internalize, we have to understand that we have Torah Sheba'al Peh from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and just like HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us the spiritual nourishment of Torah Sheba'al Peh, well, we memorialize that by eating milchik, just like the mother gives physical nourishment to the baby. Okay, that's Chassidus. Now, let's look at the halachic sources. I begin with the Kolbo, Ashkenaz Rishon. Nashim chayavot b'ner Chanukah. This is not controversial, but everyone knows women have to have exactly the same mitzvah as men in lighting Ner Hanukkah. That's simple and straightforward. Why? Afen hayuboto nes, because women were involved with the nes, the miracle of Hanukkah. Now, that's what the Gemara says. The underlined words are just the Kolbo's quotation, word for word, from the Gemara. The women, Jewish women, were involved in the miracle of Hanukkah. That's why they have the same mitzvah as men in Pirsum Hanes, in lighting Ner Hanukkah. Now, in what way were women involved? What exactly was the involvement of women in the story of Hanukkah? Perush, the Kolbo explains, the involvement of women in the Nes, in the miracle of Hanukkah, ha'oivim ba'u la'abed hakol, anashim v'nashim v'taf. Well, the bad guys wanted to destroy all of Am Yisrael. The same could be said in Purim. It was a destruction of the whole of Am Yisrael, which was at stake, men, women, and children. Oh, so just as the men were saved in the miracle, similarly, the women were saved in the miracle. Well, that's a straightforward explanation of why women are involved. Yesh meforshim, but there's another explanation, another perush. Al yidei isha, there was one woman. Ira lahem nes dolahu. There was one woman who brought about a great miracle. There was a certain woman who brought about a great miracle. In the story of Purim, we know her name, Esther. And Esther, she's the one who did it. But in Hanukkah, who was the woman who was responsible? Who was the woman who caused the miracle of Hanukkah to occur? Shema Yehudis. Her name was Yehudis. Emotion Mufurash, but Agada, and there's plenty of Agadata about this. Actually, it's not so much, but it exists. Bat Haita Yochanan Kohen Gadol. She was one of the daughters of Yochanan, who was the Kohen Gadol back in those days. Haita Yefat Toamod. She was a very beautiful lady. Very, very beautiful lady. Amar HaMelech Yavan Shetishkav Ima. The king of the Greeks, who were waging war against the Jews, the king of the Greeks said to Yehudis, the daughter of the high priest, come and sleep with me. Oh. Now what's she going to do? Hechilato tavshil shel gavina. She said, oh, of course, I'll sleep with you, but first let me prepare you dinner. And she prepared a dinner with, I suppose, Bulgarian cheese, something very salty. Bulgarian cheese, some kind of, I don't know exactly what recipe she used, but she served him, she cooked up dinner for him with very salty cheese. Kidei sheyitzma, so he would be thirsty. V'yishtet l'ro v'yishtaker. Then he drank a lot of wine and got drunk. Oh, well, she knew what to do to make him drunk. V'yishkav v'yeradem, he lied down and fell asleep. Tikach harbo, she took his sword, v'chatcha rosho, and cut off his head. And she brought the head to Yerushalayim. Kirot hachayal kimet giboram. When the Greek soldiers saw the head of their king on a pole, Yanusu, they fled. That was the involvement of women, Yehudis, in bringing about the miracle of Purim, the victory of the Jewish people. That's why we eat milchik on Chanukah, to remember the meal that Yehudis prepared for the king of Greeks, so that he would drink a lot, get drunk, fall asleep, and she could take his sword, cut off his head, take his head to Jerusalem and display it on a pole, so that the Greek soldiers would all flee and the Jewish army would win. If you're interested in more details, you could read in English. I just copied this from Wikipedia. You can read all about it in Wikipedia if you want. The book of Judith that it is referring to, Sefer Yehudit, is from the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha are a series of a shelf full, about that fat, a shelf full of books from late antiquity, which Chazal rejected from Tanakh. Right? Decisions had to be made about which Sforim were included in Tanakh and which weren't. There are plenty of Sforim circulating in those days, and decisions were made, and Sefer Yehudit was out of the canon, was not included in Tanakh. There's certain other Sforim amongst the Apocrypha, certain other Sforim which were also rejected from Tanakh, but are nonetheless quoted occasionally in the Gemara. You'll find occasionally in the Gemara a certain din, and the Gemara will ask, how do we know this? What's the source in the pasuk? What's the source in the verse? And occasionally the Gemara will answer Shena'amar, and it says, and it quotes a verse not from the Tanakh, but it quotes a verse from Sefer Ben Sira, one of these apocryphal books. So the Chazal indeed honored these books and studied them, but they were not Kisvei Kodesh. And Sefer Yehudit, the book of Judith, is one of them. And well, here you have the whole lovely story of exactly what happened. Now, let's see what the poskim make of this. We begin with the Aruch HaShulchan. Everyone knows he's one of my favorites, just over 100 years ago in Navardik from Lithuania. Rav Yechiel Michael Epstein is the name of the author. Behemshech Hazman Naase Nes Al Yedei Yehudis. It was this woman, Yehudis, who caused the miraculous victory of the Jews over the Greeks. She fed the enemy milk products. In my fantasy, I imagine it's Bulgarian cheese, but what do I know? That's why some people are makpid, some people are very strict, and therefore eat cheese on Chanukah. It's true that Yehudis was not exactly in the generation of Chanukah. The king she's talking about was one of the viceroys of Nebuchadnezzar, which was not exactly in the same generation. But the Aruch HaShulchan says it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's not exactly the same generation. It's a miraculous victory of the Jews caused by a woman who cut off the head of the opposing general. That's the Aruch HaShulchan. An older contemporary, the Ben Ish Chai, the great Rav of Baghdad, said, Ochli ma'achalei chalav b'Chanukah. Why do we eat milchiks on Chanukah? Zeichel l'nes shenasa b'chalav shalom Yehudis as oyev, because of the miraculous victory over the Greeks, which was caused by Yehudis, by this woman who cooked up a milchik dinner, a cheese dinner for the king of the Greeks. Maaseh huva b'sefer Chemdas Yom. And the whole story is told in the Sefer Chemdas Yamim. Sefer Chemdas Yamim. Alarms go off in the background. What is Sefer Chemdat Yamim? Sefer Chemdat Yamim was an immensely popular sefer. 18th, 19th century, immensely popular, published so many times, the dozens of printed editions. I mean, there are more editions of this one sefer than any other sefer from the 18th and 19th century. It was immensely popular throughout North Africa, throughout the Near East, throughout Europe, immensely popular. The sefer, it's around 6 volumes. I even saw it once for sale in a store. I couldn't resist. I bought the 6 volumes. It's arranged in the order of a machzor as it goes through the Jewish year, every event in the Jewish year, one after another, according to the calendar. And for each event, it has Kabbalistic explanations. It has a ton of minhagim for each event on the Jewish calendar. Piyutim galore. A large number of piyutim to be recited as part of the davening for every event on the Jewish calendar, together with many halachic notes about different events on the Jewish calendar. Immensely popular. Now, at one point in the mid-18th century, it was noticed that some of the piyutim, as you know, piyutim often have the first letter in each stanza. If you take the first letter in each stanza, it often spells out the name of the author of the piyut. This is quite common not only in Shabbos piyutim, but in Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur piyutim. You often have the name of the composer of the piyut spelled out as the first letter in each stanza of the poem. And these poems were apparently written by Natan Ha'azati, Nathan of Gaza, the guy from the Gaza Strip. Who was he? Natan Ha'azati, Nathan of Gaza, was a well-known charismatic character in the late 17th, early 18th century, who went from town to town throughout the Near East, mostly in the old Ottoman Empire, but he also traveled throughout North Africa and in Europe as well, not so much. He went from town to town, giving powerful, charismatic drashot, sermons, which attracted large Jewish audiences. And in his drashot, in his sermons, he announced that Mashiach is coming. And Mashiach is coming next week. Next week, Shabtai Tzvi would arrive in town. And Natan would declare him to be Mashiach. So as you probably know, Shabtai Tzvi was ruinous, absolutely ruinous for Jewish communities throughout the world, horrendously ruinous, a false Mashiach. And his prophet, who went around announcing that he's about to show up, was Natan Ha'azati. And it turns out, therefore, that Sefer Hamdat Yamim is a Sabbatean work, a work produced by the community of Shabtai Tzvi, at least in part, explicitly written by Natan Ha'azati himself. Well, a great machloket then broke out. Some, like Rabbi Yaakov Emden and the Chatam Sofer, said the Sefer must be destroyed. It's sinful. Others said, well, there's no actual Sabbatean doctrine in the doctrine of Shabtai Tzvi, the theology of Shabtai Tzvi was, as it does not say in the morning brachot, right? It does not say in the morning brachot, Baruch atah Hashem matir isurim, the theology, the doctrine of Sabbateanism is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu permits all that is prohibited, and sins, the more severe sins, carry the penalty of karet, kaf, resh, tav, and since keter, crown, has exactly the same letters, if you wish to merit the crown of the messianic period, you must violate all of the sins of the Torah, especially those which carry the penalty of karet. Well, now you understand why I said that the Sabbatean movement was ruinous for Jewish communities all over the world. Now, many rabbis said, it could be that this book was written by the adherents of Shabtai Tzvi, but there's nothing Sabbatean in the contents. The ideas are all good ideas, and therefore there's no objection to embracing the ideas and practices in the Sefer. Just to give you another random example, you've probably heard of the Seder of Tu B'Shvat. The Seder of Tu B'Shvat has no other source but this Sefer. Is it a good idea or is it a bad idea? Well, many rabbis said it's of Sabbatean origin, hands off, it must be destroyed. Other rabbis said, well, there's nothing inherently bad about having a Seder on Tu B'Shvat with cups of wine and so forth and so on, like it says in Chemdat Yamim, and it does provide an extra spiritual dimension to Tu B'Shvat, and therefore there's no objection to following it. So the book, to this very day, remains quite controversial. Nes ze naaseh kodem nes ha'ikari shel Channukah. It's true that Yehudis, the lady who cut off the head of the Greek king with his own sword, it's true that she was a few years before the period of Channukah. It's true, he's not actually involved in the Channukah story. But since it was a Greek king, and since it was a Greek army that was attacking the Jews, it's similar. The Greeks, whether in the earlier period of Nebuchadnezzar or in the later period of Hanukkah, they all wanted to eradicate Torah and mitzvahs. So we choose Hanukkah as the time to remember the Nes of Yehudis, who cut off the king's head. That's similar to the reason that we eat seeds on Purim, Zeichel and Es Shel Daniel, because Daniel, in Sefer Daniel and his friend, they were saved from the Kivshan Ha'esh, from the fiery oven. They were saved by a miracle. You read all about it in the Sefer Daniel. Not the same historical period as Purim, it's true, but on Purim we remember that by eating ziranim, by eating kitniot. ונראה לי בסייעתא דשמיא לרמוז טעם בחלב שלוש מצוות שגזרו לבטלם. There are three primary mitzvahs that the Greeks wanted to eradicate, and they're all connected with halav. Chodesh, the Greeks wanted to eradicate Rosh Chodesh from Jewish practice, which in turn would make it impossible to keep the holidays, because Pesach, Shavuos, all the holidays depend upon first knowing which day is Rosh Chodesh. Shabbos, the Greeks wanted to eradicate Shabbos, and Mila, Bris Mila. Those are the three mitzvahs that the Greeks wanted to eradicate, the three primary mitzvahs they wanted to eradicate. Rosh Chodesh, Shabbos, and Mila. Well, Het, Shin, and Mem, right? Masru Yisrael Atzmam Alehem. The Jewish people who were most nefesh for these mitzvahs. Ot Het de Chalav, who ot Rishona shel Chodesh. The first Het of Chodesh is also the first letter of Chalav. Ot Bet de Chalav, who ot Shniya shel Shabbos. Shabbos, you take the second letter and you get a Bet. The Lamed is the third letter of Mila. So you take the first letter of the first word, the second letter of the second word, the third letter of the third word, and it spells out halav. Well, here we have a remez, an additional remez for having milchik on Chanukah. As you see, the sources are somewhat fanciful. Nonetheless, the rabbis who quote these sources are supportive of the minhag to remember the miracle of Yehudis, to remember that the Greeks tried to eradicate observance of Torah, and we prevailed. Remembering these things is indeed beneficial and indeed spiritually uplifting and therefore important, even though the sources might be somewhat fanciful. Let's see. The Orchis Chaim, southern France, 12th century, quotes again the Gemara. Nashim chayavot b'ner Chanukah shafen hayu botones. Women have to mitzvah of Ner Chanukah just like men because of their involvement in the miracle. Perush, explanation. The Greeks wanted to destroy all the Jewish people, men, women, and children, and women were saved just like men were saved, and therefore their involvement with Hanukkah is the same as the involvement of men. Yesh Mefarshim, other people explain, and he tells the whole story of Yehudis. We have another source, 12th century southern France, which tells exactly the same story with the same conclusions. How does this end up in the bottom line halachic sources? The Darchei Moshe, Ramoshe Isserles, who gave us the Ashkenaz notes on the Shulchan Aruch, before he wrote the Ashkenaz notes on the Shulchan Aruch, he wrote the Sefer, the Darchei Moshe. The Darchei Moshe is written as a commentary on the Torah, and just as Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote a commentary on the Torah called the Beis Yosef, in which he draws halacha conclusions which are correct according to Poskei Sfarad, Ramoshe Isserles wrote the Darchei Moshe, his commentary on the Torah, going halacha by halacha, reaching the conclusions which are correct according to Ashkenaz poskim. So here we have Ramoshe Isserles, the author of the Ashkenaz notes on the Shulchan Aruch, saying as follows: Katav Aran, Nissim wrote, Gazru Yevanim al kol ha-betulot sheyeba'alu lahagamon tchila. The Greeks made this rule that every Jewish bride, before she sleeps with her husband, new husband, with a groom, she first has to sleep with the king of the Greeks. Al Yedei Isha Ira Nes, but one woman caused a miracle. B'Midrash, we learn that it's the daughter of Reb Yochanan Cohen Gadol. She fed the head of the Greeks cheese so he would get drunk. I imagine it was very salty, like Bulgarian cheese. Hatcha Rosho, she cut off his head. Baruch and all the Jewish brides were saved from having to sleep with him before their wedding night. Well, as fanciful as the source might be, the Darchei Moshe, Moshe Isserles, there is no superior Ashkenaz posek. He was the tops. He says this is why we have milchik, and this is then incorporated into his notes on the Shulchan Aruch. Here's the text in the Shulchan Aruch. Yesh omrim sheyesh kitzat mitzvah beribui su'udot. It's a mitzvah to eat a little bit more on Hanukkah than you would in other days, because Hanukkah was the time of Chanukah Mizbeach, when the Mizbeach was rebuilt and put into use again. Noagim lamar zmirot v'tishpachot besuda. We sing songs of Hanukkah and praises to God because the meals we eat on Hanukkah should be a sudas mitzvah. Yesh omrim sheyesh le'echol gavina b'Chanukah, and in the Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah says the opinion to eat milchik on Chanukah is correct because of the miracle that occurred when Yehudis fed the milchik meal to the king of the Greeks. Well, remember that one of the fundamental differences between the Shulchan Aruch deriving from Sephardic poskim, as opposed to the notes of the Ramah, which we just quoted, derived from the Ashkenaz poskim, one of the principal differences is that the text of the Shulchan Aruch is almost 100% rooted in pure halachic source material. The Ramah, representing Ashkenaz poskim, he's the one who introduces Ashkenaz minhagim and gives them the status of halachic obligation. And in this particular case, the minhag is rooted in the stories which we've seen above. Now, Ramosha Isserlis in the 16th century had one great opponent. In Jewish history, rabbis in not every generation, but in many generations, great rabbis come in pairs, and they disagree. There's Hillel and Shammai. There's Rav Yaakov Emden and Rav Yonasan Eibshitz. The two great rabbis of the generation who were constant loggerheads with each other and never seemed to agree about anything. Well, in the 16th century, at least among the Ashkenazim, it was Reb Moshe Isserlis and the Marashal, Reb Shlomo Luria. Those were the two big ones, and it's hard to find anything they agreed upon. We've just seen the approach of Reb Moshe Isserlis, who gave us the notes on the Shulchan Aruch. Now, let's see what the Marashal, Reb Shlomo Luria, has to say in his Sefer, Yam Shel Shlomo. He quotes the same Ran that we eat milchik on Chanukah. Hatam hu nami lepirsum hamitzvah oanes lefi shamrin b'midrash bito shel Yochanan. It's the same story. We remember the miracle that occurred because the daughter of Yochanan, the high priest, fed that milchik meal to the king. Well, so here we finally find an example where the Marashal and the Ramah are in agreement. There are so few examples of that, and that is why it is such a strongly held minhag in Ashkenaz communities to eat milchik on Chanukah. One can go on, and I'm glad I put the Hasidic material at the beginning. I originally thought to do it at the end, but I was afraid I wouldn't get to it, and indeed, I would not have gotten to it. Now, let me just end with the words of the Chai Adam, who tells basically the same story, and the cheese caused him to get drunk, and then he fell asleep, and she cut off his head. Since the miraculous salvation of the Jews was caused in part by that milchik meal that she served him, you don't have to go overboard and eat milchik at every meal, but you should have some milchik on Chanukah in order to remember the miracles. Zecher l'nes. People like me who suffer from among the many Jewish ailments in the world, I suffer from fleischophobia. Well, I know that as soon as I've eaten something fleischig, I'm not going to be able to have my cup of coffee with milk for 6 hours. And that's too much of a trial. I'd rather skip the meat. Fleischophobia is the name of the syndrome, and many Jews suffer from it. And for people like me, eating milchik on Chanukah or eating milchik during the 9 days is great. I remember my grandfather saying the happiest time in the year for him was the 9 days before Tisha B'Av because every meal was milchik. He was really happy about that. But for those of you who insist on eating meat, for those of you who really like, a fleischik meal is what you're really looking forward to. Well, at least some ktsat, at least some milchik on Hanukkah is called for according to the Ashkenaz minhag. With this, I'm going to pause and open the floor if you have any issues you want to address. All is well.
Thank you so much. And glad you brought in the Hayadam. I agree.
Okay. Next week, of course, is Hanukkah. Next week, of course, Hanukkah. We are not meeting on Hanukkah, so our next meeting is going to be 2 weeks from today. Good.
I have a maybe you dropped the ball with the Tu B'Shvat, but I'll let that go for a second. The 25th day of the 12th month is coming up, and that's 6 days away from the turning over of the guard of the Gregorian calendar, and I'm wondering how much, at least for the holiday of the 12th month, how much excitement and celebratory wishes or joy is one allowed to imply, impart, actually give, actually have?
Yeah, if you interact with non-Jews, in this time of year, it's okay to say season's greetings or Happy New Year. Something like this is permissible, but one should not wish felicitations for their religious holiday.
No, not directly.
Correct. You should not say Merry Christmas.
Okay, because it's too direct to
Yes.
idolatry. Okay, so I think I might have said and before I knew some of this, I might have said a precedent to some very close people in my
Happy New Year, Happy New Year,
life.
Happy New Year might be a little bit problematic. After all, the 1st of January on the Catholic on the Roman calendar is the feast of the circumcision. Well, it's 8 days after the birth, but my experience is that very few Roman Catholics know about this, so I wouldn't be concerned.
So that one I don't have to be concerned about, but
no, you can say Happy New Year.
but
Happy New Year is okay.
I think I've set an improper precedent though, and there's someone who's like they're in my family's life, and 100% going to interact with them, and they wish me all the holidays, and I don't know what would be good, because if I just like downgrade the whole thing to season
And
greetings.
same to you.
No, they're well, okay. And same to you. Same to you is okay.
Yes.
Okay, I didn't know. This is a fun one. Not really, but
okay. Dov, so I wish you yeah.
I do have one other. So
Sure.
You're saying there is no other source for the Tu B'Shvat Seder other than Hamdat Yamim?
Amazing.
Oh, correct. That's historically true.
We don't have any other way. They didn't get it from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai or something like that.
No. Comes straight from Hamdat Yamim.
There's no remez in the Zohar. There's nothing.
No. And if you're interested in the provenance of the book, Yari wrote one of the great bibliographical books of all time entitled Ta'alumot Sefer, a mysterious book in which he presents the evidence that it was of Sabbatean origin.
Right.
Fink, do you have an opinion on it?
Let's wait until Shvat comes, then we can talk about the Seder Shel Tu B'Shvat.
But I'm already preparing. So the hachana for the mitzvah. I don't know if it's a mitzvah.
No. Bottom line, bivadai yesh al mi l'smoch. As I pointed out, there are many great rabbis approve of the spiritual content of that sefer. The sefer is controversial, but many great rabbis approve of it.
Meaning that it's not necessarily just Rabbi, not Rabbi. It's not
Well,
just
look, the
Shabtai
Taz,
Tzvi's work.
the Taz. Who was greater than the Taz? The Taz, back in the heyday of the Sabbatean movement, uh, was quite taken by the whole movement. Let me give you an example of a real halachic approach to the matter. The great rabbis of Izmir in Turkey were presented with the following problem. There was a divorce, and one of the Eidim who signed on the get, uh, people came to the Beis Din after the divorce and said, so-and-so who signed on the get keeps his store open on Shabbos. He's not Shomer Shabbos, and therefore not qualified to be an aid, not qualified to be a witness signing on the bottom of a get, a divorce decree. And therefore the divorce decree is invalid and the whole thing has to be done over again. So the rabbis in the Beis Din were quite upset about this, and they investigated. And the question which interested them specifically was this get? What was the date on the get? Was it written before or after Shabtai Tzvi came to town in Izmir? Oh, it was written before. It was written before. Oh, that's okay. No, not just the opposite. It was written after Shabtai Tzvi came. That's good, because when Shabtai Tzvi came to town, there was initially a vast movement of tshuva. And many people who were previously not keeping Shabbos started keeping Shabbos. And probably the shopkeeper, even though there's testimony that he had his shop open on Shabbos, that was before Shabtai Tzvi. When Shabtai Tzvi came, there was initially a massive movement of tshuva. He surely did tshuva and closed his shop on Shabbos, and therefore the get is kosher. The Sabbatean movement began with a massive tshuva movement. It just went off the rails shortly after that. I've recommended in the past that if you want a good understanding of what happened, that wonderful novel by Isaac Bashevis Singer is the
Who?
story. Isaac Bashevis Singer, one of the greatest writers of modern times, Nobel Prize winner for Yiddish literature. Among his great novels is Der Sorten in Gorey, which has been translated into many, many languages. In English, it's probably called, the Satan in Gorey, I suppose. It's the story of a little village in Poland where the people initially thought that Mashiach is coming, Shabtai Tzvi, and it turned out to be the Satan. And if you want to have a clear picture and understanding of what was going on in those days, it's a novel, but historically speaking, he's got it all correct. You learn a lot about how the movement worked in that novel. And I don't know who did the English translation, but it might not be as good as the original, but I'm sure you'll get the basic idea there.
Would it give cues or things to look out for in modern day enthusiastic movements that might capture people's hearts and less of their
Well,
minds?
of course. Look. There were two great movements in the end of the 18th, the beginning of the 19th century in European Judaism. One was the Hasidic movement, and the rabbis who had just begun to recover from the disaster of the Sabbatean movement were quite suspicious of these Hasidic rabbis who gathered their charismatic Hasidic rabbis who gathered their followers around them with strange new minhagim. It sounded like a repetition of the Sabbatean movement. And the Misnagdim didn't want that to happen again. The other great movement in Jewish society, simultaneous with that, was the beginning of the Zionist movement. Now, the Zionist emblem is a six-pointed star. Six-pointed star has its historical origin as the emblem of the Sabbatean movement. Prior to the Sabbatean movement, there was nothing Jewish about the six-pointed star. The printing presses in Europe, which churned out a huge quantity of Sabbatean literature, including Hamdat Yamim, are the same printing presses which a generation later were turning out Zionist literature. The same families which bankrolled the Sabbatean movement are the same families which a generation later were bankrolling the Zionist movement. The theology, the underlying doctrine of the Zionist movement is suspiciously similar to that of the Sabbatean movement. How will we save Am Yisrael? How will we reach the Geula? We will farm the land every day of the week and every year, whether it's Shemitah or not. We will industrialize and run the factories every day of the week. The underlying doctrines of Zionism, and all of its historical sources had the rabbis sharply on edge. It looked exactly like a revival of the disaster that had occurred in the previous generation. As far as the Zionist movement is concerned, let's leave the subsequent development of the Zionist movement for other people to discuss. The Hasidic movement quite clearly did not go off the rails, but that's not something that they were able to predict in the late 17th, early 18th century.
So the Sabbatean movement captured the hearts of all Jews, and this is before every type of
just about
like all
all
types.
Oh boy, yeah, yeah. Read that novel, you'll get the whole picture. Yeah, if you want dry historical presentation, Gershom Scholem wrote a book about that fat entitled Shabtai Tzvi, where you get the driest presentation of the historical documents and detailed discussions of the exact date that this was published and who paid for it. If you want history, read Gershom Scholem. If you want a brief novel that'll just give you the feeling, give you the ideas, that's Isaac Bashevis Singer.
Wow. I don't want to delay us more, but something came up that I can't forget to say. Yehudit knew that the food would probably be checked by the king, right? So she couldn't just directly poison. So she had to choose a smarter route.
Yes.
I don't know if this is true, but that's what occurred to me.
Surely you're correct. Okay. Dov, I wish you all a good week and a safe week and a happy Channukah.
Can I ask you a quick question? I'm sorry to keep you.
Sure, Jody.
Well, a little bit of a different note, I guess. Salt, when you are making hamotzi, specifically on Shabbos, how important is it? In this scenario, somebody's made hamotzi, they cut the challah, they're waiting to eat it, and there's no salt on the table, so they're running around looking for the salt. Is that a delay? Is that a hefsek? Is it a...
justified. One is justified in taking time to find salt. As the Shulchan Aruch and most poskim say, salt should be on the table. That's not quite the same as saying you have to eat. You swallow the salt. The salt should be on the table when you make a motzi, because the table is doma lemizbeach, and there was salt on the mizbeach. Therefore, you need salt on the table. And if you're talking about home-baked or commercial challah on Shabbos, at least in Ashkenaz communities and most Sephardic communities, the bread has salt in it. It's part of the recipe. So you probably do have salt on the table. It's probably in the bread already. Of course, this doesn't apply on Pesach, where the matzah doesn't have salt in it, but well, most recipes have salt. Certainly the
So
commercial bread does.
it's still justified to wait for.
Oh yeah, yes. But the Shulchan Aruch says you should have salt on the table, and in a sense, you do have it on the table. It's in the bread, but someone who wants to fulfill the literal minhag of the Shulchan Aruch that justifies a delay between the Tilas Yadayim and Hamotzi.
And the dipping of the challah into the salt, that's neither here nor there.
Different minhagim. Some people do, some people don't. After all, our bread is lechem naki. The dipping of the bread into salt back in the days of the Gemara had to do with a cheaper bread where the flour was not so clean. But even in the days of the Rambam, pat nikiya, if the bread is baked from clean dough, in all of our dough, all of our flour today, commercial flour is all clean. That doesn't really require salt.
So you don't even need the salt in the bread, and if it's clean dough, you don't even need it in the.
Yeah. Those who don't use salt on Pesach, matzah, even in their days, matzah was always made with clean flour, with clean ingredient, and therefore, even in those days, salt was not required for matzah and Pesach.
How does that rectify though with the idea that the salt on the mizbeach? Because that's talking about the flour, the clean flour, and here's talking about salt on the mizbeach.
Two entirely different ideas, and some posts can follow this idea, but it's only a minhag, right? Some minhagim are rooted in this idea, some minhagim are rooted in that idea. But on Pesach, I've not checked in people's private homes, but I have the impression that most people on Pesach are not putting the matzah into salt, because in Leil HaSeder, it's essential to eat the matzah pure as it is, without any other tastes mixed into it, until you come to the korach. And therefore, no dipping of salt in Leil HaSeder. I'm pretty sure that's the most common practice. Not that I checked in people's homes what they're doing, but...
How does honey fit this story?
Absolutely apostles the mitzvah of matzah if you do it in Leil HaSeder.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, during the week.
But challah on Shabbat.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for asking, Jody.
Tov, I wish you a good week and a safe week and a happy Hanukkah, and look forward to seeing you all again after Hanukkah.
Thank you.
Okay, until then.
Bye-bye.
Shalom.
Shalom. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.